The morning sun cast long shadows across Table Bay as hundreds of enslaved hands lifted blocks of local slate and sandstone, their sweat mixing with the salt air of the Cape of Good Hope. It was April 1666, and beneath the watchful gaze of Dutch East India Company overseers, the foundation stones of what would become Africa's oldest surviving colonial fortress were being laid with methodical precision. Commander Zacharias Wagenaar surveyed the construction site, knowing that this pentagonal star fort and would serve as the beating heart of Dutch colonial power for centuries to come. But the irony was profound. This Castle of Good Hope, its name promising prosperity and salvation for European traders, was being built by the very people for whom hope had been systematically extinguished. Indigenous Khoi laborers worked alongside enslaved Africans and Asian prisoners, their combined suffering literally cemented into every wall, every bastion, every stone that would rise from this contested ground. The work progresses with great difficulty. Wagenaar would write to his superiors in Amsterdam, "Yet the foundation of our empire in these southern seas must be secured at any cost." He could not have imagined that his fortress would become both symbol and instrument of 3 centuries of racial oppression, its walls bearing witness to the birth of what would become apartheid South Africa. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. The fate of an empire hung in the balance. On this windswept peninsula, at the southern tip of Africa, for the Dutch East India Company, the Castle of Good Hope represented far more than a mere fortress. It was the linchpin of their entire Asian trading empire, the critical way station that could either secure or shatter their dominance over the lucrative spice routes to the Indies. Without a permanent, defensible base at the Cape, Dutch ships faced a perilous journey around Africa's treacherous coastline, with no guaranteed refuge. The alternative routes, controlled by the Portuguese and increasingly challenged by English rivals, threatened to strangle the very lifeblood of Dutch prosperity. Every month of delay in establishing this fortress meant potential losses, measured not merely in guilders, but in the strategic advantage that had made the Netherlands a global maritime power. The stakes extended beyond commerce into the realm of geopolitical survival. If the castle failed to materialize, if the harsh African conditions proved insurmountable, the English or the French would inevitably claim this strategic prize. The Cape commanded the sea lanes between Europe and Asia. Whoever controlled it would control the flow of gold, spices, and silk that fueled European expansion. But for the indigenous Khoi peoples, the stakes were existential in an entirely different sense. This fortress would formalize their dispossession, transforming traditional grazing lands into the cornerstone of a colonial apparatus designed to extract wealth while denying basic humanity to Africa's original inhabitants. The success or failure of these walls would determine whether the Cape remained African or became irreversibly European, a question whose answer would echo through centuries of oppression and resistance. The winds of global commerce had been shifting for decades when the first stones of the castle were laid, and the Dutch East India Company found itself navigating increasingly treacherous political waters. By 1666, the VOC had already established itself as the most powerful trading corporation in human history, its tentacles reaching from the Spice Islands of Indonesia to the trading posts of Japan. Yet this very success had painted a target on Dutch ambitions as English, French, and Portuguese rivals circled like predators, sensing weakness. The Cape of Good Hope had been discovered by Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias in 1488, but for nearly 2 centuries, it remained little more than a provisioning stop for ships rounding Africa's southern tip. The Dutch first recognized its strategic potential in 1647, when the crew of the wrecked ship Haarlem spent a year ashore. They returned to Amsterdam with reports of fertile land, fresh water, and a climate that could sustain European settlement. This intelligence proved prophetic. The Cape offered something no amount of gold could purchase: a permanent foothold at the crossroads of 2 oceans. Jan van Riebeek's arrival in 1652, with 3 ships and 90 men, had established the first Dutch settlement. But 14 years of makeshift fortifications and temporary structures had proven woefully inadequate. The initial Fort de Gouda Hoop, a simple star-shaped earthwork, reinforced with timber, crumbled under the relentless Cape winds and seasonal rains. Ships continued to be lost to storms, supplies spoiled in inadequate storage, and the constant threat of attack from rival European powers made every voyage a calculated risk. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, raging from 1665 to 1667, had exposed the vulnerability of Dutch interests worldwide. English privateers prowled the sea lanes, and the very real possibility of an English assault on the Cape that forced the VOC's hand. Directors in Amsterdam understood that temporary expedients would no longer suffice. The empire required a fortress that could withstand both human enemies and the brutal forces of nature. More pressingly, the VOC faced an economic reality that made the Cape's development inevitable. The company's Asian territories generated enormous wealth, but only if that wealth could safely reach European markets. Ships laden with pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and Chinese porcelain represented fortunes that could bankrupt nations if lost. The treacherous waters around the Cape had already claimed dozens of vessels, each wreck representing not merely financial loss, but strategic defeat in the broader struggle for global dominance. The indigenous Khoi peoples, who had initially welcomed Dutch traders as potential allies against Portuguese encroachment, increasingly recognized the existential threat posed by permanent European settlement. Intermittent conflicts had already erupted as Dutch cattle ranching expanded beyond the original settlement boundaries, and the construction of a massive stone fortress would signal an irreversible commitment to territorial conquest. Rather than mere commercial exchange, this convergence of imperial ambition, economic necessity, and geopolitical pressure created the crucible in which the Castle of Good Hope would be forged, not as a monument to Dutch ingenuity, but as a fortress built on the fundamental inequalities that would define South African society for centuries to come. The architect's vision existed only on parchment when Commander Zacharias Wagenaar first unrolled the plans before his assembled engineers in the spring of 1666. The design, a pentagonal star fort with 5 imposing bastions, represented the pinnacle of European military engineering, borrowed from the fortifications that had protected Dutch cities during their long struggle for independence from Spanish rule. Yet translating these precise geometric lines into African reality would require a transformation of both landscape and human lives on a scale unprecedented in the Southern Hemisphere. The quarries sang with the rhythm of hammers against stone as teams of laborers extracted the raw materials that would become the castle's foundation. Local slate, quarried from the slopes of Table Mountain, provided the darker stone that would form the fortress's lower courses, while yellow sandstone from nearby Robben Island supplied the distinctive masonry that would give the castle its enduring character. Each block required careful shaping by skilled stonemasons, many of them political prisoners and craftsmen transported from the VOC's Asian territories, their expertise purchased with chains rather than wages. The labor force assembled at the construction site revealed the global reach of Dutch colonial exploitation. Enslaved Africans, captured from the coasts of Angola and Madagascar, worked alongside indigenous Khoi men, whose traditional hunting grounds had been appropriated for the fortress. Asian prisoners, political dissidents from Java and Ceylon, whose crime had been resistance to Dutch rule, brought sophisticated knowledge of stone cutting and architectural techniques. Together, they formed a workforce whose diversity reflected the international scope of the VOC's imperial ambitions. Wagenaar established a brutal rhythm of construction that began before dawn and continued until the African sun disappeared. Behind Table Mountain, the laborers must understand, he wrote to his superiors, that this fortress serves not merely our immediate needs, but the eternal glory of the company. In these distant lands, guards armed with muskets and Shambach's heavy leather whips ensured that this understanding penetrated even the most reluctant hearts. The engineering challenges proved as formidable as the human ones. The Cape's notorious southeaster winds could halt construction for days at a time, scattering scaffolding and tools across the building site like leaves in a storm. The seasonal rains turned the foundation trenches into quagmires, requiring constant drainage and reinforcement. Salt air corroded iron tools with relentless efficiency, forcing regular replacement of equipment that had been shipped at enormous expense from Amsterdam. Most challenging of all was the scale of the undertaking itself. The castle's walls would eventually stretch nearly a kilometer in circumference, rising 15 meters above the foundation, and requiring an estimated 60,000 cubic meters of dressed stone. This represented not merely construction, but the creation of an entirely new urban landscape: barracks for soldiers, workshops for craftsmen, storage vaults for the precious cargo that would flow through this imperial gateway. As the first courses of stone rose from the African earth, they carried with them the weight of countless individual tragedies. Each perfectly fitted block represented hours of forced labor, each precise angle the product of skills torn from distant homelands and pressed into service for an empire that offered nothing in return but survival. The southeaster struck with the fury of an ancient god. On the morning of the 12th of August, 1668, transforming 2 years of painstaking construction into a battlefield between human ambition and natural force, Wagenaar watched in horror as scaffolding that had taken months to erect collapsed in moments, crushing partially completed walls and burying precious tools beneath tons of African stone. The very earth seems to conspire against our endeavors, he confided to his journal that evening, ink still trembling from his shaking hand. Yet we shall not be moved from our purpose, though the elements themselves rise against us. The storms were merely the most visible manifestation of a resistance that permeated every aspect to the castle's construction. Beneath the surface, a more insidious form of defiance emerged from the laborers themselves. Tools disappeared with suspicious frequency. Mortar was sabotaged with sand and salt water, and the precise measurements that defined European military engineering somehow became imprecise in African hands. Master stonemason Willem van der Merwe reported to his superiors that the native workers possess a stubborn ignorance that cannot be cured through instruction alone, requiring constant supervision and frequent correction. The Khoi peoples, led by chieftains like Ganama and Doman, watched the fortress rise with growing alarm and mounting resistance. What had begun as occasional cattle raids evolved into systematic harassment of construction crews venturing beyond the immediate building site. Supply wagons found their wheels sabotaged, water sources mysteriously contaminated, and grazing land for the castle's livestock somehow became inaccessible overnight. Doman, who had learned Dutch during earlier peaceful contacts, served as both diplomat and intelligence gatherer, using his linguistic skills to understand the true scope of European ambitions. From Amsterdam, the pressure mounted, with every ship that arrived bearing dispatches from the VOC's board of directors. The company's shareholders had invested enormous sums in the Cape project, and their patience thinned. With each report of delays and cost overruns, the directors grow restless. Wagener noted in a dispatch to his predecessor's successor, Commander Cornelis von Quailbergen. They speak of the castle as though it were a simple trading post rather than the foundation of empire itself. They understand florins and guilders, but not the weight of African stone or the resistance of African souls. The winter of 1669 brought not only devastating rains that flooded the foundation trenches, but also a form of resistance that struck at the heart of the colonial enterprise. A coordinated work slowdown among enslaved laborers threatened to halt construction entirely. Their passive defiance, more effective than any direct assault. Productivity plummeted as workers discovered infinite ways to misunderstand instructions, misplace materials, and misalign stones that would require complete reconstruction. The fortress walls absorbed these pressures like a sponge. Each course of stone, representing a small victory, wrested from an unwilling landscape and an increasingly restive population. The very mortar seemed infused with conflict, Dutch ambition binding together African materials through the forced labor of global victims. As Wagener observed in his most candid moment, we build not merely with stone and lime, but with the accumulated sufferings of 3 continents. Each block carries the weight of empire, and empire, I have learned, is a heavier burden than any man should bear. Yet the walls continued to rise, in testament to a determination that would brook no resistance, natural or human. By 1672, as the castle's walls reached their full imposing height, the fortress had transformed from architectural ambition into something far more profound, a stone manifestation of the fundamental contradictions that would define South African society for centuries to come. For the Dutch settlers, who sheltered within its pentagonal embrace, the castle represented the triumph of European civilization over African wilderness, a beacon of order imposed upon chaos. Yet for those whose labor had raised every stone, whose blood had mixed with the mortar, the same walls symbolized the architecture of their own dispossession. The VOC officials who walked the castle's ramparts saw reflected in its bastions the mathematical precision of Dutch commercial dominance. Each carefully angled wall represented a calculated investment in imperial permanence, every gun emplacement to a declaration that Dutch authority would endure long after the last spice ship had departed for Amsterdam. Governor Simon van der Stel, Wagenaar's successor, proclaimed in 1679 that this fortress stands as eternal testament to the wisdom and strength of the company, a monument that shall outlive empires and inspire fear in the hearts of our enemies for generations yet unborn. But beneath the castle's stones lay a different truth, one that whispered through the quarters, where enslaved families huddled against the Cape winter. For them, the fortress represented not protection, but imprisonment. Its walls, designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep captive laborers in. The very skills that had built the castle, the architectural knowledge of Javanese craftsmen, the stoneworking traditions of Malagasy quarrymen, the indigenous understanding of local materials had been conscripted into service for their own subjugation. The Khoi peoples, whose ancestral lands now lay beneath European stone, saw in the castle's completion the final seal upon their dispossession. Chief Ganama, in his last recorded words before retreating into the interior, spoke with prophetic clarity. They have built their stone kraal, not to hold cattle, but to hold the future itself prisoner. What rises here in stone will fall one day in blood. His prediction would echo through the centuries that followed, a curse embedded in the fortress's very foundations. Perhaps most tragically, the castle came to symbolize the transformation of human beings into mere instruments of empire. The diverse workforce that had labored to create this monument, Khoi herders, Malagasy prisoners, Javanese political exiles, West African captives, had been reduced to interchangeable units of production, their individual histories and cultures dissolved into the anonymous mass of company labor. The fortress walls had been built not just with stone and mortar, but with the systematic destruction of countless personal identities. As construction neared completion in 1679, 13 years after it began, the Castle of Good Hope stood as more than a military fortification. It had become a machine for producing and maintaining racial hierarchy. Its pentagonal design perfectly suited to the geometric precision with which European colonialism would divide, categorize, and control African humanity. The same walls that promised security to Dutch merchants would serve as the prototype for centuries of segregation. Their architectural logic eventually expanded into the elaborate legal framework of apartheid itself. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a fortress to protect trade had evolved into an instrument for the systematic dehumanization of an entire continent. The castle's stones would bear witness to this metamorphosis. Their silence, more eloquent than any proclamation of colonial victory. Today, the Castle of Good Hope stands as South Africa's oldest surviving colonial building, its weathered walls bearing silent testimony to 3.5 centuries of transformation, resistance, and reckoning. Tourists walk its ramparts, photographing cannon emplacements and colonial architecture, yet few comprehend that they tread upon ground and that witnessed the birth of institutionalized racial oppression in southern Africa. The fortress has outlived the Dutch East India Company, the British Empire, and the apartheid regime, emerging as an accidental monument to the endurance of both human cruelty and human resilience. The architectural DNA of the castle, its geometric precision, its systematic separation of spaces, its hierarchical organization of human movement would replicate itself across the South African landscape for centuries. The same logic that divided the fortress into carefully segregated quarters for Europeans, enslaved laborers, and indigenous workers would eventually manifest in the Group Areas Act, the pass laws, and the elaborate spatial architecture of apartheid. In this sense, the castle represents not merely a historical artifact, but the foundational blueprint for a society built on the systematic denial of human equality. Yet the fortress also embodies a more complex legacy. Within its walls, cultures collided and sometimes merged in ways that colonial authorities never intended. The Malay cooking traditions of enslaved Indonesian women influenced Cape cuisine. Khoi-Click languages left their mark on colonial Dutch, and architectural techniques from across the Indian Ocean found expression in local building practices. The castle became, despite itself, a crucible of cultural fusion that would define the unique character of Cape society. In post-apartheid South Africa, the castle has been transformed from a symbol of oppression into a site of remembrance and education. Its museums now tell stories that colonial commanders would have suppressed the experiences of enslaved laborers, the resistance of indigenous peoples, the human cost of imperial ambition. School children learn not only about European military engineering, but about the African hands that lifted every stone, the Asian skills that shaped every arch. The Castle of Good Hope endures as a reminder that monuments to power are also inevitably monuments to the powerless, that every stone carries within it the memory of those who suffered to place it there, and that these memories, like the fortress itself, prove far more durable than the empires that sought to contain them. Stand before the Castle of Good Hope today and listen carefully to the wind that still sweeps across Table Bay. In its whisper, you might hear the voices that official histories have tried to silence. The Khoi herders, whose land became the foundation stone. The enslaved craftsmen, whose skills built walls that would imprison their descendants. The Asian political prisoners, whose resistance was crushed into mortar and memory. The castle stones remember what empires I prefer to forget. That every monument to power is built upon the accumulated sufferings of the powerless. That every fortress designed to project strength ultimately reveals the fragility of those who feel compelled to build it. In the end, the Dutch East India Company's eternal fortress outlasted its creators by mere decades, while the human stories embedded in its walls echo across centuries. History belongs not to the victors who commission monuments, but to those who suffer to build them. Their voices, like stone itself, prove more enduring than empire.